By May 1945, the Pacific War had entered a phase so brutal that even hardened veterans felt something shift in the air. The closer the American forces pushed toward Japan, the more ferocious and desperate the resistance became. The kamikaze was no longer just a tactic. It had become a full defensive system, layered, coordinated, and terrifying in its determination. The Americans called it the Steel Curtain. Because to reach the Japanese home islands, the U.S. Navy had to sail through walls of suicide planes thick enough to feel like metal. And Okinawa was where that curtain closed. On May 4th and May 11th, 1945, two of the largest kamikaze operations of the war were launched. Kikyusui No. 5 and Kikyusui No. 6, mass waves of suicide aircraft converging on the U.S. fleet from every direction. That morning, aboard the U.S. destroyer USS Hugh W. Hadley, DD 774, a soft breeze drifted across the deck as men prepared for another day of endless picket duty. Somewhere out there, just beyond radar range, were hundreds of kamikazes waiting for the order to launch. At 7:06 a.m., the radar operator stiffened. Contact. Many. Then more. Dozens. Then too many to count. He whispered the words no sailor wanted to hear. We've got a whole damn Air Force coming. The captain issued the order. General quarters, this is it. The ship's klaxons wailed across the steel decks. Gunners climbed ladders, ammunition handlers unlatched crates, AA crews tightened their straps, steadying themselves. The horizon began to flicker, tiny flashes of sun against wings. Then the sky broke open. It started with Japanese fighters attacking the CAP, American Hellcats clawing upward in twisting spirals of smoke and tracers. For a moment, the battle stayed miles above the fleet. But the kamikazes weren't aiming for air superiority. They were aiming for impact. The first group of attackers came in low, skimming the waves. Zeros, Oscars, and a few outdated trainers repurposed into flying bombs. The Hugh W. Hadley fired the opening shot. Her 5-inch guns thundered, spewing bursts of flak that tore the sky into black blossoms. The destroyer USS Evans, positioned alongside, joined the barrage. Together, the two ships formed a deadly crossfire. But the kamikazes kept coming. A Zero broke through the curtain, wobbling from damage but still aiming for Hadley's bow. The 14 Bofors found it first. A chain of impacts rippled across the aircraft, blowing its wings apart in a single flash. It fell into the sea. But two more rushed behind it. The first crashed into USS Evans, smashing into her aft section and detonating in a roar of flame. The second banked hard, diving for Hadley. The destroyer rolled sharply, nearly tipping her own gunners off balance. The plane missed by a narrow margin, shearing past the starboard railing and splashing just meters away. The explosion lifted the ship clear of the water. Shrapnel tore through the decks, several men fell, others rose to gather their weapons again. Because the sky was still full. The next wave was larger. 20, maybe 30, aircraft dove in from altitude, their engines howling like a pack of wolves. Many were already burning from CAP interceptions, trailing smoke across the sky. One of them, a crippled Val, spiraled downward, its pilot fighting the controls. It smashed into the sea behind Hadley, but its bomb skipped across the water like a stone, slamming into the destroyer's hull and blasting open a section near the waterline. Alarms screamed. Flooding compartments. Ammunition lockers on fire. Power flickering. But Hadley's crew held their positions. Because there was no choice. Another kamikaze slammed into Evans, tearing the destroyer nearly in two. Smoke billowed across the picket line, black and boiling. Then the worst happened. A large formation of fighters broke through the American CAP, and descended in a coordinated suicide run directly toward Hadley. It was a wall of aircraft. A single, unified storm. Gunners fired until their ammo belts ran dry. Replacements slammed in new belts. Shells hit aircraft out of the sky in flaming arcs, but gaps formed instantly as more planes poured through. A Zero dove straight into Hadley's stern, exploding in a fireball that incinerated the aft 20 crew. Another crashed into the starboard side, ripping away railings and sending shrapnel through the crew like razor shards. The ship groaned, listing, bleeding smoke and fire. Then came the final blow. A third Kamikaze, a Nakajima Kai-43, fell out of the smoke and plunged into Hadley's superstructure, detonating directly against the ship's 5-inch mount. The explosion was so violent that observers thought the destroyer had been split in half. Men were thrown dozens of feet. Flames roared up through broken decks. The ship trembled like a wounded animal. And yet, as she stayed afloat, the Hugh W. Hadley had shot down 23 enemy aircraft in a single battle. More than any other destroyer in U.S. naval history. But she had been hit 3 times. Burning, flooding, barely alive. As the last Kamikaze crashed into the sea, the captain looked across the deck, twisted metal, scattered bodies, fires still snapping along the hull. He whispered, "This is what the invasion of Japan will look like. If this was only Okinawa, what waited beyond the horizon?" Because Japan was preparing something worse than kamikaze aircraft. Something the Americans didn't yet fully understand. A defense plan so massive, so fanatical that if executed, it would have drowned the Pacific in blood. Operation Ketsugo. The defense of the homeland, where every shoreline, every road, every hill, and every family would become part of the suicide resistance. A final storm. A national sacrifice. And it was coming. The closer the Allies crept toward the Japanese home islands, the more the sea itself seemed to change temperament. What had once been the predictable mathematics of naval warfare, torpedo patterns, dive bomb arcs, carrier sortie cycles, had twisted into a new, terrible calculus. How many men would choose to die today, and how many ships would they take with them? By early summer 1945, the American fleet had begun to speak of kamikaze zones the way infantrymen spoke of minefields. Sailors described an almost physical weight in the air, a tingling along the skin that told them something was coming. They never knew from where. They only knew it would appear screaming out of the sun, riding a column of wind and fire. On the destroyer USS Newcomb, the watch crew had grown jumpy after weeks of radar blips that turned out to be drifting wreckage, lost balloons, or migrating flocks of birds. Every alarm felt like the start of their final minutes. The ship had already taken damage, splintered plates, scorched paint, men buried at sea with quiet prayers. Now the crew lived suspended between 2 kinds of fear, the fear of relaxing too much and the fear of never relaxing again. At 09:20 on a grey morning, lookouts spotted movement low on the horizon, 3 specks glinting white against the dark swells. Bogies low and fast, the call went up, claxons wailed, men sprinted to stations, hands shook on throttles and shell rammers. The first plane banked, exposing its rising sun insignia, and suddenly every doubt evaporated. It came in just above wave height, wobbling slightly in the wind, close enough that sailors could see the pilot's white headband flapping behind him. A column of tracers stitched toward him. Splashes marked the sea where rounds landed short. The pilot held his line. The Newcomb's forward 5-inch battery thundered. The shell struck near the engine cowling, sending smoke trailing behind the aircraft, yet still it kept coming. The gunners cursed under their breath, men braced. And at what felt like the final heartbeat before impact, the burning plane veered sharply, smashing instead into the nearby destroyer Stanley, engulfing her mid-deck in a geyser of flame and torn metal. The Newcomb crew felt the heat, even from 200 yards away. There was no time to watch the aftermath. The second plane was already diving, this one from higher altitude, nose down in a near-vertical plunge, the sunlight turning its canopy into a glinting star. Hard to port, officers shouted. The ship lurched as the helm responded. Anti-aircraft guns filled the sky with black bursts and whirling shrapnel. This pilot came closer than anyone wanted him to. The final 50 yards felt like a slow-motion nightmare, a trail of smoke, the howl of the engine, men screaming warnings even as they fired. At 20 yards out, a single .50 cal round punched through the cockpit. The plane dipped at a strange angle, clipped the railing, and tumbled into the water in an eruption of steam and foam. The shockwave threw several sailors off their feet. Before anyone could process what had happened, a third shape appeared, not from the horizon but dropping straight from the cloud layer like a hawk. Another one, high, the ship's guns were still reloading. The sky-black bursts hadn't reset. For a split second, the Newcomb was naked. Then a nearby carrier's Corsair dove in, guns blazing. Tracer fire shredded the Kamikaze at the midpoint of its dive, and the Japanese fighter disintegrated in mid-air, pieces spiraling into the ocean like burning leaves. The Corsair pilot pulled up at the last possible second, his engine coughing smoke. Men aboard the Newcomb erupted into cheers, pounding the bulkheads, shouting into the wind. But the cheering died almost immediately, because every man aboard knew the truth. This was just the morning attack. By afternoon, the horizon shimmered again. Radar screens filled with contacts, too many to count cleanly. Radios buzzed with fragmented warnings. Squadrons of kamikazes, some guided by veterans, others flown by boys barely trained, swept toward the task force in loose waves. On the battleship Maryland, crewmen watched in horror as a fighter broke through a curtain of flak and dove toward the transport ship Gilliam. The transport had little in the way of heavy guns and even less maneuverability. It never stood a chance. The kamikaze struck directly amidships, igniting fuel stores and ammunition boxes in a chain of explosive roars that swallowed the ship in a tower of smoke. By the time destroyers arrived to assist, the Gilliam was already sinking, taking dozens of soldiers and sailors with her. The sea boiled with fire. For hours, the air trembled with the constant rumble of explosions, planes diving, guns answering, ships burning, crews shouting. The ocean itself was littered with wreckage, wings, shattered propellers, drifting life jackets, and bits of charred wood. The stench of fuel hung heavy, mixed with cordite and smoke. But the most haunting sound of all was the silence that came afterward. When the attacks finally ceased at dusk, survivors stood along the rails staring out at the dimming horizon. The adrenaline drained out of their bodies, leaving them hollow-eyed, exhausted, shaking. Some men smoked quietly, others prayed. A few simply stared at their hands as if surprised they were still alive to see them. On ships across the fleet, corpsmen tended to burns, shrapnel wounds, smoke inhalation, broken ribs from blast concussions. Chaplains moved among the injured, whispering comforts. On destroyers, damage control teams waded through knee-deep water in dark compartments, trying to stop the flooding before it reached boilers or ammunition stores. And yet, for all the destruction, the Japanese had not broken the line. The fleet continued its slow crawl toward Okinawa. The carriers kept launching sorties. The transports kept delivering soldiers. The battleships kept firing their massive guns into fortified positions ashore. And every sailor knew the same grim truth: tomorrow would bring another wave, and the next day another still. For the kamikaze pilots, this was a journey toward symbolic immortality. For the men on the ships below, it was a grinding ordeal of survival, one that tested the limits of human endurance. In the end, the question was no longer who would win. The question had become much simpler. How many would die before it was over? Night fell over Okinawa, but darkness offered no comfort. The sea glimmered black and silver under the moon, calm on the surface, but beneath, hundreds of sailors clung to life in sinking vessels, firelight flickering like distant warnings. Survivors huddled on decks, soaked in seawater, covered in smoke and ash, counting those lost. Some whispered prayers. Others stared silently, unable to process the day. But the Japanese had learned from experience. Kamikaze attacks were no longer just daylight strikes. Night attacks were now in preparation. The fleet soon faced a terror invisible until the last moment. Radar picket stations strained against the darkness. The operators squinted at screens, trying to detect the faintest blips. Out of the darkness, shapes appeared, silhouettes barely visible against the night sky. The pilots flew low, hugging the waves, engines muffled by the lack of daylight, only the faint glimmer of starlight catching on wing tips. At 0247, USS Little picked up movement. The officer of the deck called quietly. "Contact, starboard quarter, low altitude, estimated 6 aircraft." Crewmen scrambled to battle stations, hearts pounding. Every hand gripped a weapon, every eye scanned the black expanse, every brain calculated angles of attack. The first Zero appeared, skimming above the waves, pilot fully committed to death. Anti-aircraft rounds lit up the night like flashes of lightning. Tracer lines arced across the sea, black puffs exploding into white blossoms. The Zero ducked between bursts, nearly invisible in the darkness. It struck the destroyer Little near the aft deck in a flash of fire that illuminated the terrified faces of nearby sailors. Chaos erupted. The ship groaned and tilted slightly under the force of the impact. Others tried to evade, but night made everything slower, less precise. Another kamikaze followed, slicing across the water with terrifying accuracy. The 20 gunners fired point blank. The aircraft wobbled but did not falter. It slammed into the deck just forward of the bridge, sending steel and flames into the air. Smoke and screams filled the night, and yet the crew, trained by repeated attacks, continued firing at incoming shapes, using flares to track their movements. Amid the chaos, a young sailor on the bridge noticed something. The enemy was coordinating. Aircraft moved in patterns designed to confuse the AA crews, some acting as decoys while others aimed for the hull. The night attacks were calculated, refined, and deadly. There was no hesitation, no mercy, only precision in self-sacrifice. The ship's captain shouted orders over the shrieking wind and rolling smoke. "Keep firing, don't let them stop you, protect the fleet." Yet even as guns barked and shells detonated, another wave emerged on radar, a second line out of nowhere. The Japanese had learned that repeated waves exhausted the ship's ammunition and crews. Already the decks were slick with seawater and blood. Guns were jammed, barrels glowing red-hot from continuous fire. Every round fired risked overpressure or misfire, and still more planes came. A lone pilot flying a burned-out Zero seemingly ignored the AA fire entirely. The aircraft spiraled downward, smoke streaming from a wing, yet the pilot adjusted continuously, correcting for every hit. He was the embodiment of kamikaze doctrine, unstoppable momentum, single-minded focus, total surrender to fate. The plane clipped a mast, then struck the deck, detonating a bomb beneath the forward gun emplacement. Flames shot skyward. Crewmen were thrown overboard. Others dove into compartments, trying to fight back flooding and fire at the same time. Yet against the odds, the ship stayed afloat. Elsewhere, another destroyer picked up small craft, an early form of suicide motorboats skimming toward the fleet. The Americans had prepared nets and obstacles, but some still breached the outer perimeter. Explosions rocked the water as boats slammed into hulls. Fire spread like wildfire across wooden and steel decks. The sailors' eyes were wide with disbelief. These were attacks unlike anything they had faced before. By the end of the night, the survivors counted the cost. Ships damaged or sinking, 5. Sailors dead, 120. Aircraft destroyed, dozens. But the psychological cost was even greater. Every man knew the next day would bring the same nightmare. Kamikaze attacks were relentless, adaptive, and horrifyingly effective. And now, under cover of darkness, the Japanese had proven that no time of day offered respite. As dawn approached, ships drifted in smoke-filled waters, fires smoldering along twisted decks. Crews assessed damage, generators sputtered, guns jammed, hulls flooded. Yet remarkably, the fleet survived. The Americans had learned something critical. No single wave, day or night, could destroy the resolve of a determined crew. But the fear, the tension, and the human cost were mounting, and the war in the Pacific was entering its most desperate, brutal phase. The sea itself seemed scarred by human intent. Every wave carried echoes of fire, smoke, and sacrifice. Every deck was a testament to survival, courage, and endurance. And the world would never forget the men who lived and died under the sky that had turned into knives. By June 1945, the full weight of the kamikaze campaign was evident. The The US Navy had learned to fight them, to anticipate their attacks, and to shoot down dozens before impact, but the human and material cost was staggering. Each ship carried the scars of fire and steel. Each sailor carried the memory of a plane diving at impossible speed, a pilot committed to death, and the horror of men and comrades vanishing in an instant. Among the Japanese pilots, training was rigorous but brief. Most were barely 18. Their families had already accepted their fate. Society had celebrated their courage as sacred. Pilots would kneel before shrines, write letters they would burn, and pray for guidance from ancestors. Honor and death were inseparable, a doctrine instilled through ritual, repetition, and the certainty that failure was shameful beyond description. The Americans, in turn, came to understand something terrifying. These were not just aircraft, they were human weapons, and that gave them a fatal edge. A plane piloted by a man could maneuver in ways a missile or torpedo could not. It could adapt, dodge, and commit to an attack with a precision no machine could match. Anti-aircraft fire could destroy the plane, but never the intention. The intent remained, haunting the sailors long after the flak cleared. Aboard the USS Terry, stationed near the Higashi beaches, sailors had grown accustomed to the threat. Radar blips flickered continuously, sometimes forming confusing clusters. Every approaching aircraft had to be evaluated, friend or foe, fighter or suicide plane. Time to engage too soon and you might waste ammo, too late and the ship, and everyone aboard was doomed. At 08:15 the first wave appeared. Smoke streaked across the horizon. Japanese Zeros dove in from the sun, engine wails piercing the morning air. Destroyers opened fire, tracers crisscrossing the sky. One pilot, a young ensign Kuroda, banked sharply to avoid flak, then adjusted for the deck of the Terry, aiming for the aft 5-inch gun mount. The explosion ripped apart railings and hurling debris, killing 3 gunners instantly. Fires ignited along the deck. Crewmen scrambled to douse flames, hauling buckets, spraying hoses, and pulling mangled bodies to safety. Seconds later, a Val dive bomber came in low, attempting to hit the bridge. The gunners struck, but the plane's bomb released early, bouncing off the deck before detonating against the hull. Another sailor went overboard screaming. The chaos seemed endless. Each man acted by training, instinct, and sheer willpower. The ship had to survive because the next wave was already forming. This relentless pace was psychological warfare as much as it was physical. Sailors endured exhaustion beyond imagination, firing guns continuously, running from fire to flood, carrying wounded and listening to the screams of their comrades. Sleep, food, even thought became luxuries. Yet their discipline held, their collective focus was the only armor they had. Across the fleet, reports filtered in, 25 ships damaged, 12 heavily, hundreds of lives lost. Yet the kamikaze losses were equally severe. Hundreds of aircraft had been shot down or destroyed, their pilots never reaching their targets. In the grand calculus of war, Japan was running out of men as well as machines, but their willingness to sacrifice them made each attack lethal. In one small, tragic instance, a pilot's plane hit the deck of a destroyer with such force that the impact lifted the ship partially out of the water. Sailors described hearing a guttural roar, steel groaning, and the explosion of ammunition. Survivors recalled looking at each other, eyes wide, understanding that death was as near as breath. They counted themselves lucky and cursed the luck that left others behind. The Americans began calling this the price of honor. Not their honor, not Japan's honor, but the price exacted in blood, courage, and human endurance for every inch of the Pacific they controlled. Every sailor knew it, every pilot accepted it, and yet the war continued. By mid-June, the attacks were evolving. The Japanese tried night strikes, multi-layered attacks, and even disguised aircraft. They experimented with new approaches to kamikaze missions, testing the Americans' defenses. Some were too daring, too desperate, and ended in disaster. Others succeeded, leaving ships burned, torn, and crippled. Each engagement left its mark, not just physically but mentally. The sailors began to understand the scale of sacrifice on both sides. For every destroyed plane, there had been a man with a family, a story, and a name. And in the minds of the US Navy, this forged a grim respect for the enemy. The kamikazes were not mindless, they were willing, trained, and single-minded. They had taken the art of self-sacrifice to new levels, weaponizing devotion and terror. The Americans responded with tenacity, technology, and discipline, but they could never fully eliminate the psychological terror. As June faded into July, the fleet prepared for the next major invasion, the assault on the Japanese mainland. Kamikaze attacks would escalate again as Operation Ketsugo was finalized. Every ship, every sailor, every gunner knew that survival would depend on skill, luck, and the endurance of human courage against a relentless, determined enemy. And the lesson of the kamikazes became clear. This was not a war fought only with bullets and bombs. It was a war of spirit, of sheer will, and of the human capacity to confront death head-on. Every deck scarred by fire, every sailor surviving a dive, every ship still afloat was a testament to that truth. By mid-1945, the Americans had grown familiar with the patterns of kamikaze attacks. They expected waves, trained their crews, and even developed advanced radar tracking and interceptor coordination. Yet the Japanese had adapted as well. They had begun experimenting with stealth tactics, low-altitude approaches, night assaults, diversionary flights, and small aircraft that hugged the waves to avoid radar detection. The enemy had become invisible, unpredictable, and almost omnipresent. Aboard the USS Laffey, sailors had survived multiple attacks over the months, but fatigue had begun to weigh heavily. Eyes red from lack of sleep, muscles aching from constant battle stations, and minds burdened by loss, they had learned that vigilance was the only armor that mattered. Every radar blip was a potential killer. Every shadow across the water could be death incarnate. On July 9th, the radar operator's quiet voice broke the tension. Low-level contacts, starboard side, multiple aircraft. The crew snapped to life, guns rattled to life, shells loaded, men braced themselves. The first silhouettes appeared over the waves, a handful of Zeros, their dark shapes almost merging with the water in the dim morning light. They dived toward the destroyer with lethal precision. The gunners fired, tracers weaving a net across the sky. One aircraft disintegrated mid-air, but another corrected its trajectory and adjusted for the fire. It struck the starboard deck, its payload exploding in a flash that illuminated the terrified and exhausted faces of the sailors. Flames roared along the hull, and smoke spiraled into the sky. It was a familiar scene by now, but no less terrifying. The Americans had learned to anticipate attacks, but the Japanese had perfected the human element. Every dive was a story of commitment, skill, and desperation. Pilots were trained to gauge the exact moment to release bombs, the precise angle to hit a moving target, and the final, fatal commitment to crash into the ship. It was war transformed into ritual, and every ritual exacted a heavy toll. Some sailors described it as watching death dance across the sky. Planes darted unpredictably, twisting and banking with frightening intent. Every flash of tracer fire could be a hit or a signal of doom. The men kept firing until every round was spent, sometimes running to reload manually as ammunition belts ran dry. The night was filled with the thunder of guns, the roar of engines, and the screams of injured men. A single plane, already smoking from AA fire, managed to breach the forward defense. It hit the destroyer near the bridge, creating a shockwave that knocked several crew members to the deck. Others scrambled to fire their weapons, extinguish flames, and rescue their injured comrades. Despite the chaos, the destroyer remained afloat, her steel scarred but her crew determined. Meanwhile, other ships in the fleet faced similar attacks. Some were damaged beyond immediate repair, others were hit multiple times but stayed in the fight. The psychological toll on sailors was immense. They were exhausted, terrified, and often felt powerless, but the fear sharpened their focus and hardened their resolve. The Americans began to understand that kamikaze pilots were not merely following orders, they were embracing death as an instrument of war. It was a weapon the Allies could counter physically, but not psychologically. Every surviving sailor knew the truth. The enemy's human element was both their deadliest weapon and their most tragic. By afternoon, radar reported additional contacts far beyond the visible horizon. Kamikaze pilots were coordinating in ways the Americans had never anticipated. Faint attacks drawing AA fire while other aircraft approached undetected. Ships fired relentlessly, the air thick with flak bursts, smoke, and the metallic taste of cordite. Some pilots adjusted mid-flight, demonstrating ingenuity and courage in the face of certain death. Others failed, spiraling into the sea in smoking wreckage. Despite all precautions, the attacks inflicted heavy casualties. Men were burned, drowned, or crushed by debris. Decks were torn open by impact and blast. Fires raged uncontrollably in some compartments. Still, the fleet persevered, moving slowly closer to Japan. The survivors' accounts would later describe an invisible enemy, one that could not be fully tracked, predicted, or destroyed before reaching its target. It was the essence of the kamikaze threat: unpredictable, lethal, and human. The Navy responded with continuous training, improved radar coverage, concentrated AA fire, and the development of picket lines designed to detect low-flying aircraft before they reached the fleet. Yet even with these measures, the psychological weight never lifted. Every sailor knew that the next wave could be the one that ended their life. Every shadow, every radar blip, every faint sound over the ocean could herald the final moment. The kamikaze campaign had evolved beyond simple attacks. It was a war within a war, a battle of human will against human sacrifice. And as the Allies prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, the lessons of Okinawa loomed large. Courage, resilience, and adaptability were as essential as guns, armor, and ships. The invisible enemy was everywhere, and the only way to survive was to confront it relentlessly, again and again. The summer of 1945 was a season of shadows, not the long shadows cast by the sun, but the shadows of death looming over every American ship in the Pacific. Kamikaze attacks had become a near-constant threat, waves of aircraft descending from dawn to dusk, sometimes at night, each carrying a human payload of desperation and devotion. On the USS Jeffers, sailors had grown used to the smell of smoke, the taste of cordite, and the constant vibrations of nearby explosions. But familiarity did not dull fear. If anything, it sharpened it. Every approaching aircraft carried the potential for disaster. Every passing flak burst reminded them of their mortality. At 0630, lookouts spotted three small silhouettes rising from the horizon. They were Zeros traveling low to avoid radar. Bogies, port quarter, the call went out. The crew scrambled, hearts hammering. Guns rattled, ammunition belts crunched into place, and sailors braced themselves. The first plane dove like a falcon. Its engine screamed against the wind. Tracers stitched the sky, but the pilot corrected constantly, dodging the fire. With terrifying precision, it struck the starboard deck of the Jeffers, detonating near the 20 mounts and sending sailors flying. Flames erupted, filling the deck with smoke and heat. The second aircraft followed closely. The crew fired relentlessly, but it maneuvered around their guns, banking at the last moment to hit the aft section. Explosions tore through railings, deck plating, and nearby compartments. The third attempted to follow the first two, but gunners managed to tear it apart before impact. Pieces of the aircraft rained across the deck, mingling with smoke, fire, and debris. For the crew, the assault was both physical and psychological. They had seen death before, yet every strike carried a new intensity. Some sailors froze in shock. Others moved instinctively, fighting for their ship, their brothers, and their own survival. Nearby ships were not spared. Across the picket line, destroyers and transports were under simultaneous attack. Some vessels were hit repeatedly, forcing sailors to battle fires, flooding, and chaos all at once. Smoke curled into the sky like dark fingers visible for miles. The kamikaze pilots were young, mostly boys by modern standards, trained in just weeks or months. Yet their commitment was absolute. They understood that death was inevitable, but they embraced it as the highest form of duty. Each attack was meticulously calculated, every dive executed with precision, and every collision intended to maximize destruction. It was a form of warfare that blended ritual, courage, and desperation in equal measure. Aboard one destroyer, a sailor later recalled, "You didn't just fight the planes, you fought the thought that someone wanted to die for this, and that scared you just as much as the bullets." By midday, the attacks subsided, leaving the fleet to assess damage. Ships were listing, decks burned, and hundreds of men were either wounded or dead. Some vessels had lost entire gun crews. Others had flooded compartments, threatening boilers and engines. And yet the fleet endured. Ships moved cautiously, crews repaired what they could, and lookouts scanned the horizon, expecting the next wave. The Americans realized that the kamikaze was more than a tactic. It was a psychological weapon. It forced constant vigilance, drained resources, and tested the limits of human endurance. Even when the aircraft were destroyed before impact, the effect on morale was profound. Sailors were on edge, sleep-deprived, and mentally exhausted. Each engagement left a scar, invisible to outsiders but deeply embedded in every mind aboard the ships. The Japanese, for their part, had begun to experiment with multi-directional attacks, launching aircraft from different angles simultaneously. Some flew at low altitude to avoid radar, while others appeared from the sun or high above, diving with deadly accuracy. The combination of skill, desperation, and sacrifice made the kamikaze nearly impossible to predict. By the end of the day, survivors gathered on decks to tally the cost. Damaged ships outnumbered those untouched. Hundreds of men had been injured or killed, and yet the fleet remained operational. The Americans had adapted, learned, and survived, but the shadow of sacrifice remained, stretching far beyond the horizon. As night fell, the fleet moved cautiously, aware that kamikaze attacks could resume at any moment. Fires still burned on damaged decks. Flooded compartments were patched as best as possible. Exhausted sailors kept watch, their eyes scanning the black water, their ears listening for the hum of an engine that could signal the next death from above. The kamikaze campaign had become a symbol of the desperate, fanatical defense of Japan. Every pilot who took off knew the odds, embraced them, and committed to a fatal act. And every sailor who survived understood the cost, not just in lives, but in courage, endurance, and the thin line between survival and death. In the Pacific, death had taken a form that no one had truly experienced before. It was sudden, unrelenting, and carried on wings. And for the sailors, every night they slept on those ships, they knew the shadow of sacrifice would return with the dawn. By late July 1945, the relentless nature of kamikaze warfare had reshaped the very rhythm of the Pacific campaign. Sailors awoke, ate, fought, and slept, or tried to sleep under the constant threat of sudden, fatal impact from the skis. Every horizon held danger. Every radar blip could be death incarnate. Aboard the USS Longshore, the men had developed a grim routine. Early morning drills, constant scanning, gunnery practice, and maintenance all blended into a day measured not in hours, but in the number of incoming aircraft intercepted. The crew had learned that anticipation was survival, yet no amount of preparation could erase the tension. At 05:45, lookouts spotted the first wave, 5 Mitsubishi Zeros low and fast skimming the surface of the water. Radar had detected them moments earlier, but by the time the crew reacted, the planes were almost upon them. Anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The sky lit up with tracers, black clouds of flak blossoming like deadly fireworks. The first plane veered slightly under fire but maintained its dive toward the deck. It struck the forward gun mount, exploding in a ball of fire and steel. Crewmen were thrown across the deck, hoses, tools, and spent shell casings scattered everywhere. Another plane adjusted mid-dive, targeting the aft section. Its payload detonated near ammunition lockers, sending shrapnel into compartments below. The ship shuddered under the impact, yet the gunners continued firing, determined to protect both the vessel and their comrades. This relentless aerial assault was a test of human endurance. Sailors fought fires, rescued the wounded, reloaded weapons, and coordinated with nearby vessels, all under the shadow of death. Some ships lost entire gun crews in a single strike, forcing replacements to move into exposed positions seconds later. Exhaustion, fear, and adrenaline mingled into a cocktail that left men both hyper-alert and teetering on the edge of collapse. The kamikaze pilots, meanwhile, were executing missions with deadly precision. Many were young men barely trained, yet their commitment was absolute. Each dive was measured, every trajectory calculated, every collision designed to maximize destruction. It was not only a physical attack but a psychological weapon, forcing the Americans into constant vigilance and fatigue. In one particularly harrowing moment, a Zero, heavily damaged by AA fire, corrected its course midair and struck the ship's bridge. The explosion tore apart steel supports, killed several officers instantly, and ignited fires that spread toward fuel storage. The remaining officers and sailors fought to regain control, extinguishing flames while keeping the ship in formation. The fleet's response evolved in tandem. Picket lines were strengthened. Radar operators coordinated with fighter aircraft to intercept attacks earlier. Ships altered course, spread out, and adjusted firing patterns. Every measure improved survivability, yet the kamikaze threat remained adaptive and unpredictable. No ship was safe, no maneuver guaranteed. By late morning, the sky was thick with smoke, fire, and debris. The water was littered with flaming wreckage, yet the Americans persevered. Ships continued their mission, damaged but afloat, firing at incoming aircraft, rescuing sailors overboard, and moving closer to the Japanese mainland. For the sailors, each day brought the same lesson. Survival depended on vigilance, courage, and adaptability. The human element of the kamikaze, the pilot's willingness to die, their precision and their relentless focus was what made them deadly. Ships could be repaired, crews could be replaced, but the constant, unpredictable nature of the attacks imposed a psychological toll that would linger long after the war. The kamikaze campaign had become emblematic of the Pacific War itself, brutal, unrelenting, and defined by human sacrifice on both sides. Each attack, each destroyed plane, each damaged ship was a testament to the extremes of war. The Americans learned to counter, to endure, and to adapt, but the shadow of death in the sky was ever present, and every surviving sailor carried its weight in memory, fear, and resilience. As night fell, the fleet moved cautiously, aware that kamikaze attacks could resume with the first light. Fires were extinguished where possible. Flooded compartments were patched. Exhausted sailors rotated watches, scanning the horizon for the faintest hint of an approaching aircraft. And in the darkness, the Pacific whispered of the next wave, the next strike, the next test of human courage. By early August 1945, the Pacific campaign had reached a fever pitch. Kamikaze attacks were no longer sporadic, they were a daily siege, testing every ounce of skill, courage, and endurance of the US Navy. Ships that had survived weeks of assault now bore deep scars. Twisted steel, scorched decks, burned railings, and the lingering smell of cordite, smoke, and seawater mixed with the acrid scent of burning fuel. Aboard the destroyer USS Barker, the crew had adapted to the terror, but it came at a cost. Exhaustion shadowed every face. Sleep was fitful, measured in stolen moments during rotations at the gun stations. Even the bravest sailors carried the memory of planes that had torn through their ships, friends lost in explosions, and decks flooded with fire and debris. At 0710, radar operators detected incoming aircraft from the northeast. The call went out. Multiple bogies, low altitude, approaching fast. The crew sprang into action. Anti-aircraft batteries roared to life, tracer lines stitching the sky with deadly precision. Flames and smoke burst across the water as shells exploded near the first kamikaze, attempting to divert it. The plane wavered, but the pilot adjusted, banking slightly to strike the port side near the aft gun mount. The impact ignited ammunition boxes, sending debris and fire across the deck. The second aircraft followed almost immediately. Despite being hit multiple times by gunners, it crashed near the forward superstructure, throwing sailors from their stations and collapsing portions of the deck. Chaos reigned. Men moved instinctively, fighting flames, rescuing comrades, and firing at the next incoming plane. The screams of the injured mingled with the roar of engines, gunfire, and the crackle of explosions. Across the fleet, other ships faced similar devastation. Some were hit multiple times, forcing emergency repairs while under fire. Decks were mangled, compartment doors buckled under impact, flooded sections threatened boilers and weapon systems. The psychological toll was as severe as the physical damage. Sailors knew that survival was a matter of constant vigilance, and yet exhaustion and fear made every new wave feel impossible. Kamikaze pilots, young men trained for a single fatal mission, embodied both desperation and devotion. Many were barely 18, sent into battle with minimal flight experience, yet each dive was executed with terrifying precision. The goal was simple: maximum destruction at the cost of their own lives. This was war transformed into ritual, a deadly expression of honor and sacrifice. By midday, the attacks had taken a heavy toll. On the USS Barker, 8 sailors were killed instantly and dozens more were injured. Fires raged across the deck despite the relentless efforts of damage control teams. Smoke rose in black clouds that mingled with the morning haze, visible across the fleet, and yet the ship remained afloat, its crew fighting not just for survival but for the mission itself. The Americans had learned to anticipate kamikaze patterns: low-altitude dives, sun-angle approaches, feints to draw AA fire. Picket ships and radar coordination improved interception rates, but no tactic could fully negate the psychological impact. Every blip on the radar could be the next plane to strike. Every flash in the sky could signal death. Some sailors described it as facing an invisible enemy that refused to die. For the men below, the threat was constant. Sleep, food, and even thought were luxuries. The kamikaze forced them into a perpetual state of alertness, their every action dictated by the possibility of instant death. Yet amidst the fear and chaos, courage and instinct prevailed. Guns were manned, fires were fought, and comrades were saved. Survival became both a personal and collective act. The kamikaze campaign had evolved into more than a military tactic. It had become a test of endurance, resilience, and mental fortitude. Ships could be repaired, decks rebuilt, and sailors replaced, but the shadow of fear and loss lingered in every compartment and across every bridge. Each surviving sailor carried memories of destruction, fire, and the human cost of war, a burden as heavy as any cannon or shell. As evening approached, the attacks slowed but did not cease. Sailors checked their guns, patched floodings, and tended to the wounded. Some men stared out over the darkened water, reflecting on those lost, both friend and foe. The Kamikaze had exacted a price measured not only in ships and men, but in the resilience and fortitude of those who remained. The Pacific Fleet continued its slow advance toward the Japanese mainland. Every surviving ship was a testament to human endurance under extreme conditions. Every sailor who remained alive had faced death in its most personal and terrifying form, diving aircraft piloted by men committed to self-destruction, and had lived to tell the story. In the end, the Kamikaze attacks were more than a military strategy. They were a relentless test of human courage, a measure of devotion and sacrifice on both sides, and a haunting reminder of the human cost of war. The shadow of fire would linger long after the last plane had fallen, leaving scars visible on ships, minds, and memory alike. By mid-August 1945, the Kamikaze campaign had reached its peak intensity. The Allies knew Japan's defeat was imminent, yet the human cost of every remaining engagement was staggering. The Pacific waters were littered with flaming wreckage, burning ships, and the desperate cries of sailors clinging to survival. Death, once a distant threat, now arrived from above with unrelenting precision. Aboard the USS Harrison, sailors prepared for another day of chaos. Early morning drills were replaced by emergency fire and damage control rehearsals. Men had learned to react instinctively, fire around, reload, duck, rescue a wounded shipmate, all while keeping the ship operational. Every action could mean the difference between survival and destruction. At 06:12, radar blips announced the approach of multiple aircraft from the northwest. The officer of the deck called quietly but urgently. "Bogies inbound, low altitude, estimated 6 zeros." The crew snapped to action. Guns were raised, shells loaded, and sailors braced. Anti-aircraft fire lit the sky as tracers wove a deadly web, and the first Kamikaze dove toward the destroyer. Despite being struck by multiple rounds, it corrected its trajectory and slammed into the aft deck near the 5-inch guns, igniting a fire that spread toward ammunition lockers. The ship groaned under the impact, and men scrambled to contain the blaze while returning fire at the remaining aircraft. Another plane approached, veering slightly to avoid the concentrated AA fire. It struck the superstructure, sending shrapnel and debris across the deck, injuring multiple crewmen. The chaos was total. The roar of engines, explosions, flames, and shouting created a sensory overload that left even the most seasoned sailors momentarily disoriented. Yet training and instinct kept them moving, repairing, firing, and surviving. The psychological toll of kamikaze attacks was as severe as the physical. Sailors had grown accustomed to seeing planes strike decks, friends lost instantly, and ships consumed by fire. Sleep deprivation, constant tension, and the unrelenting threat of sudden death created a mental battlefield as intense as the ocean itself. Every radar blip, every shadow on the horizon, every flicker in the sky was a potential harbinger of destruction. The Japanese pilots had become masters of desperation. Each dive was calculated for maximum impact. They could correct mid-air, evade AA fire, and strike with deadly efficiency. For the Americans, the experience was harrowing. Machines driven by humans willing to die for every inch of territory. Anti-aircraft fire could stop the plane, but never the intent. The will to destroy remained, and that made kamikaze attacks uniquely terrifying. By late morning, fires raged across multiple ships. Decks were warped, railings melted, and ammunition compartments were scorched. Crews moved frantically, extinguishing fires, patching hulls, and tending to the injured. Some ships had been struck repeatedly, and the crew's endurance was pushed to the limit. Yet even in the face of near destruction, the fleet remained operational, a testament to human resilience and discipline under extreme pressure. As the day wore on, radar reported additional incoming aircraft from the south. The Americans adjusted their formations, coordinated fighter cover, and readied every gun. Kamikaze pilots attacked in waves, sometimes feinting from one direction to draw fire while others approached undetected. The battle became a deadly dance of skill, courage, and sheer survival. For the sailors, it was a constant reminder that the Pacific War was fought not only with steel and fire but with human willpower. Ships could be repaired, guns could be replaced, crewmen could be reassigned, but the relentless mental strain, the trauma of witnessing death, and the knowledge that the enemy would not hesitate to die themselves left an indelible mark on every survivor. By evening, the attacks subsided, leaving behind a fleet scarred but unbroken. Ships were listing, fires smoldered, and decks were twisted and charred. Yet the Americans had endured. They had faced the edge of destruction and survived. Each ship, each crew, each sailor was a testament to perseverance under conditions that tested the limits of human courage. The Kamikaze campaign, though nearing its final stages, had shown the world a new form of warfare, one that combined human devotion, desperation, and skill to create an almost unstoppable weapon. And for those who survived, the experience would remain forever etched in memory, a reminder of both the horrors of war and the extraordinary resilience of those who endured it.